Hey all, welcome to 5.2. This is going to focus on the tropical coral reefs that we have throughout the world. So some things we need to know, just the overall overview is tropical coral reefs are built in tiny coral polyps. And basically what that means is they are going to create these small colonies and then they'll grow larger and larger. And they have a mutualistic relationship with photosynthetic zooxanthellae. And therefore, they're going to be limited to where they can actually live because they're going to need sunlight and warm temperatures and, of course, more shallow and clear water. So the polyps themselves are actually consumers and they are going to require some source of nutrients. So they can either gain some of their nutrients from the zooxanthellae or they can actually capture their own small fish or small organisms and digest them. So how do reefs form? Well, first, they need pretty warm temperatures, so about 23 to 25 degrees Celsius, not very wide ranges for temperature, very narrow, so they like warm water. Coral reefs also need to be in tropical regions, so like 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south of latitude. Now, they also need sunlight because we just said that they have a relationship with zooxanthellae. We talked about this relationship also in chapter 2 when we said mutualism. An example is zooxanthellae and coral. Another example, of course, would be if we were talking about boxer crabs and sea anemones, meaning they both benefit. So zooxanthellae live inside of the coral. The zooxanthellae need sunlight. So if they need sunlight, they also need clean and clear water. So that means if things are suspended, like sand is suspended in the water, it's not going to allow for sunlight to penetrate the zooxanthellae, which means they won't be able to grasp that sunlight and use it to convert it to glucose and oxygen. They also need to be at a suitable depth within that 25 meters from the surface, because if they're too deep, again, the light intensity is going to decrease. And then remember, 5.1, we said at about 100, 200 meters, that's when we start to see sunlight intensity decrease even more, where it becomes dark. Now, while coral likes to be in shallow water, they also cannot be exposed to air, meaning they can't be sitting out on the beach. They cannot be left out of the water because they'll die. They need the water in order to gain their oxygen. And of course, the zooxanthellae need to be in the water to gain carbon dioxide. They also need a suitable or hard substrate to attach to, so usually like a rocky bottom to grow on. Now, how do reefs form? We also call them atolls. So how does an atoll form? It's going to be, first, there needs to be a volcano that erupts, creating an island. This island, under the right conditions, can start to see a reef form around the very outskirts of the island. This is called a fringing reef. But remember, just like the previous slide, we need to have the correct or best conditions for the reef formation. So a fringing reef is going to surround the very outskirts of the island. Then, of course, we know that the volcano is no longer erupting, so there's no more land being built on this island. Instead, we start to see the land, the island, sink. Now, when it sinks, it's going to force that fringing reef outward, creating a lagoon and a barrier reef. So we went from a fringing reef very close to the island now to a settled island that pushes the reef out, creating a barrier reef with a lagoon in between the reef and the island. Finally, we have an atoll. So now this is after a very long time. We're going to see the island completely submerges under the water, leaving a small ring of islands with a lagoon in the center. So it's a circular lagoon, and that's going to be an atoll surrounding by a reef. Finally, usually what we see in these lagoons, we're going to see something called patch reefs. They are isolated small reefs that grow vertically. Coral polyps. Although chapter 4, we talked about a lot of organisms and their structures, coral polyps are a little bit more special. We do need to know the phylum, which is Cnidaria, which just means stinging cells. We know that coral have two ways of gaining nutrients, one from zooxanthellae and the other from being able to sting their prey. So on the tentacles of a coral polyp, they have nematocysts. The nematocysts are stinging cells that actually stun prey and allow for the tentacles to bring food into the mouth. So coral doesn't walk or move on its own. It's a sessile organism, meaning wherever it grows, that's where it stays. There are two types of coral. We have hard coral, like staghorn coral, and that's going to be calcified, so it's hard. Then we have soft coral. For an example, we have sea fan coral. So you should know the structures like the tentacles that are going to bring food into the mouth, which is part of the digestive system. And then coral are very simple organisms. They have a one way in, one way out system. So food in, waste out of the same opening, which is their mouth. The theca is the thick wall that actually surrounds one coral and attaches it to another coral. And then there's a calyx, which is which the individual coral actually sits in. It's like a cup structure where the coral sits in, one coral polyp into the theca. At the bottom of the theca, that's called the basal plate, where the coral can actually attach to a rocky substrate. Now, why are coral important? Well, first, coral reefs are going to be important because they absorb wave energy, meaning when waves are coming in, they don't eliminate wave energy. They actually absorb some of wave energy. So they reduce erosion on our beaches. Then we have habitat. So a lot of organisms, we know that coral reefs from chapter 2, we said how biodiverse they are. Coral reefs are extremely biodiverse. So that means if there's habitat for a lot of organisms, that's going to increase biodiversity. Also tourism. People are going to pay a lot of money to go and dive at these coral reefs to see all of the life. And finally, we can use coral reefs for medicines like cancer, arthritis, Alzheimer's treatments. But what causes reef erosion, which is just the breakdown of a coral reef? Well, first, if the coral reef is exposed to air, that's going to kill the reef because they cannot be exposed to air. They have to be in shallow water, but they cannot be exposed to air. Predation. The crown of thorn starfish, COTS, actually consumes coral reefs. Now, it does maintain a good balance in a coral reef. However, if there is too many crown of thorn, or if there are too many crown of thorn starfish, that's going to actually break down the reef rapidly, causing it to die. Physical damage. If there's tourism, obviously, if people are diving, they could accidentally break parts off from a coral reef. Boats anchoring, if they drop their anchor, not realizing there is a coral reef below, they may break parts of the coral reef. pH changes. That means if global warming is occurring, we could see that potentially the water is getting too warm. Also, pH may change because of human impacts like pollution. So pollution could also affect a coral reef because, again, if there is trash that becomes entangled around a coral reef, it could suffocate and kill the coral. If the pH changes, that means maybe the ocean is becoming too acidic. It's called ocean acidification, and that causes a coral reef to die. And finally, storm damage. When there are very strong storms, the waves and the impact of the storm can actually harm a coral reef. Now that's for a natural reef, but we do use artificial reefs in order to support the natural reef to try to help rehab it and bring it back. But of course, there are some disadvantages. Although we're using tires and emptied cars and concrete structures, it could be difficult for us to install. It's obviously going to be expensive. We could also see some hazardous materials being released into the ocean. And sometimes we actually see that an artificial reef supports invasive species. So it actually allows for more invasive species to live around our natural reef, which would end up harming our natural reef. So as always, if you have any questions, you always refer back to your ACE Marine syllabus on the Cambridge website in order to understand the learning goals that you need to know about coral reefs. As always, if you like this video, please subscribe, like it, and listen to the next video on 5.3.